The Pacific War was not only a clash of empires, but also a brutal contest of endurance. Under the burning tropical sun, soldiers on both sides struggled through mud, heat, and hunger. The air was thick with humidity and the stench of decay. On the beaches of Guadalcanal and the jungles of New Guinea, life and death were often decided within minutes. Yet, among the thunder of artillery and the scream of incoming shells, something extraordinary began to emerge. Allied soldiers who were hit, who should have been doomed by blood loss or infection, were being saved. And within days, some of them were even returning to the front. For the Japanese troops watching from the other side, it was as if their enemies had found a way to outwit mortality itself. Imagine being a Japanese soldier crouched in a foxhole, your uniform soaked with rain and sweat, watching through your binoculars as the enemy retrieves their wounded under fire. You expect those men to die. That was the rule of war, you knew. Yet days later, you face the same soldiers again, healed, armed, and ready. Whispers start to circulate through the ranks. Some call it luck, others witchcraft. But soon, even the most skeptical among them realize that what they are witnessing is not luck. It is science at work, a kind of warfare they had never imagined. As the battles dragged on, the environment itself became another enemy. Malaria spread like wildfire, wounds festered in the damp heat, and supplies were scarce. The Japanese army, driven by an ideology of sacrifice and self-reliance, placed little emphasis on medical logistics. Their field hospitals were often nothing more than tents, with a few overworked doctors, lacking anesthesia, clean bandages, or antibiotics. Meanwhile, the Allies seemed to carry hospitals wherever they went. Portable surgical units, clean instruments, and trained medics appeared alongside every battalion. For Japanese soldiers, who had grown accustomed to seeing comrades die from minor infections, this was both shocking and demoralizing. The difference became more visible with every encounter. When Allied troops stormed a beach, medics followed closely behind, carrying stretchers and metal kits filled with vials, syringes, and small bottles labeled penicillin. Japanese scouts reported seeing these strange materials, yet few could understand their true purpose. They only saw the results, wounded men living when they should have died. To them, the Allies' resilience was unnatural, almost blasphemous. They had been taught that honor lay in accepting death. Now they faced an enemy that fought not only to win, but also to live. For the Japanese command, this presented a troubling puzzle. Reports from the front lines described soldiers baffled by the enemy's recovery rate. They spoke of men who had been shot one week and returned to fight the next. Some believed that the Americans had developed a secret tonic, a divine blessing perhaps, that made their bodies immune to suffering. Others, more pragmatic, began to suspect that Western medicine had advanced far beyond Japan's reach. Whatever the truth, the psychological impact was devastating. It was one thing to face a stronger army, but it was another to face one that seemed impossible to kill. In the jungles of Burma, the difference took on an almost mythical quality. Japanese units, cut off from supplies, resorted to herbal remedies and crude surgeries performed with bayonets heated over campfires. Across the lines, Allied medics worked under portable lamps, transfusing blood, stitching wounds, and administering antibiotics. The wounded groaned, bled, and screamed in both camps, yet the outcomes could not have been more different. In the Japanese tents, silence often followed after a few hours. In the Allied ones, the groans slowly turned to steady breathing, and then to sleep. The early months of the Pacific Campaign revealed a truth that many Japanese soldiers did not yet fully understand. They were fighting not only an industrial giant, but also a medical one. The enemy's strength did not lie solely in its machines or its numbers. It was hidden in small glass bottles, in organized field hospitals, and in the hands of young medics trained to bring men back from the edge. The Japanese army, proud and disciplined, had entered the war with courage and conviction. But courage alone could not stop infection, and conviction could not replace lost blood. By the time the sun set on those first bloody battles, the contrast was undeniable. The Allies could afford to save their men. The Japanese could not. The difference was not just technological, it was philosophical. For one side, the preservation of life was part of victory. For the other, sacrifice was the highest form of duty. This clash of beliefs, as much as weapons, would shape the psychological landscape of the Pacific War. And as the conflict deepened, Japanese soldiers would learn, to their horror, that science could be as powerful a weapon as any rifle or bomb. As the Pacific War intensified, the gap between Japanese and Allied battlefield medicine became impossible to ignore. On the beaches of Tarawa, Saipan, and Leyte, Japanese soldiers witnessed scenes that defied everything they had come to believe about war. When an American soldier was hit, medics rushed forward without hesitation, pulling him to safety while under fire. Within minutes, they cleaned the wound, stopped the bleeding, and injected mysterious fluids into his veins. The wounded man often screamed in pain, but did not die. Days later, the same man was seen again, weapon in hand, charging forward. To the Japanese who saw this from a distance, it was as if the Americans had found a way to bring the dead back to life. For the Imperial Japanese Army, this was incomprehensible. Their understanding of battlefield medicine was rooted in self-discipline and sacrifice. Soldiers were taught to endure pain, to accept injury as a path to honor, and to die rather than be captured or slow down their unit. Medical evacuation was limited, and few resources were allocated to treating the wounded. In contrast, the Allies saw every wounded soldier as worth saving, not only for humanity's sake, but also for military efficiency. Every man saved was a man who could fight again. This mindset gave the Allies a practical advantage, while the Japanese clung to a sense of fatalism that quietly eroded their strength. The battlefield itself revealed this contrast with cruel clarity. On one side, Japanese field hospitals overflowed with wounded men lying on bamboo mats, their wounds untreated, their fevers raging. Supplies were scarce and infection spread faster than any surgeon could stop it. The stench of blood and decay hung thick in the air. On the other side, Allied medical tents buzzed with activity. The smell of antiseptic and the hum of generators replaced the odor of death. Doctors and nurses moved methodically from one patient to another, using tools and medicines that seemed miraculous to those who had never seen them before. Reports from Japanese intelligence units began to document these observations. Officers described strange glass bottles filled with clear liquids, machines that pumped air into lungs, and powders that healed infections within hours. But without access to these supplies, such reports did little more than deepen frustration and disbelief. Some officers even dismissed the accounts as exaggerations meant to excuse battlefield losses. Yet for those who saw the results firsthand, denial was no longer possible. The Allies' medical superiority was real, and it was changing the nature of war. The difference was not only material, but also emotional. Allied soldiers fought with a certain confidence, knowing that if they fell, help was coming. They trusted their medics, their equipment, and the unseen network of doctors waiting behind the lines. That trust became a kind of morale armor, protecting them from despair. The Japanese, on the other hand, faced their wounds with resignation. They knew that once injured, survival was a matter of luck, not care. The knowledge that they would likely die alone in a tent or jungle clearing cast a shadow over even the most courageous hearts. One Japanese medic later described his despair in a diary recovered after the war. He wrote of amputating limbs with field knives, of watching comrades die from infections that could have been cured with a single injection. He had heard rumors of a Western medicine called penicillin, said to stop infection almost instantly, but he had never seen it. His entries reveal a quiet tragedy, a sense that Japan was fighting not only a stronger army, but a more advanced civilization. For every bullet fired, there was an invisible battle being fought against disease, and Japan was losing it. By mid-1943, the contrast was visible even to Allied observers. American and Australian troops who captured Japanese camps were shocked by the state of enemy medical facilities. They found makeshift operating tables, rusted scalpels, and piles of unwashed bandages. Some captured Japanese soldiers expressed disbelief at the cleanliness and organization of Allied hospitals. They spoke of it as if it were magic. One even remarked that the Americans treated their men like family, not tools. Such comments revealed the profound cultural divide that separated the two militaries. In this growing contrast, the moral of the war began to shift. For the Allies, saving life became a symbol of progress and humanity. For the Japanese, death in battle remained the ultimate expression of loyalty. But on the battlefield, ideals mattered less than outcomes. A wounded soldier who lived could fight again, while a dead one could not. As months turned into years, the Allies' capacity to heal gave them not only more soldiers, but also more hope. And for the Japanese, watching them recover again and again, that hope was perhaps the most devastating weapon of all. Long before the Pacific erupted into flames, the foundations of modern wartime medicine had been laid in laboratories, hospitals, and universities across the Western world. In the years between the two world wars, scientists and military planners began to understand that survival on the battlefield depended not only on courage, but also on biology. The horrors of World War I had taught them painful lessons. Thousands had died from infection rather than bullets, from wounds that festered because there were no antibiotics or proper sanitation. Determined to never repeat those mistakes, Western nations began investing heavily in medical science. By the time World War II began, the Allies carried with them not only weapons, but also a new understanding of how to save lives. At the heart of this transformation was penicillin. Discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928, the drug remained a laboratory curiosity for more than a decade. It was only in the early 1940s that scientists in Britain and the United States found a way to mass produce it. What followed was one of the greatest collaborations between science and industry in history. Factories were repurposed, laboratories expanded, and chemists worked day and night to refine production. When penicillin finally reached the battlefield, it became a miracle in a vial. A single injection could stop infections that had once been fatal. Soldiers who would have lost limbs or lives in previous wars now stood a chance to recover fully. Alongside penicillin came another revolution: blood plasma. During World War I, blood transfusions had been limited by the need for direct donor-to-patient procedures. In the 1930s, medical researchers discovered that plasma, the clear liquid portion of blood, could be separated, stored, and transported safely. This meant that medics on the front lines could replace lost fluids quickly without needing a donor nearby. The Allies developed mobile plasma units that followed troops into battle, allowing life-saving transfusions to happen within minutes of injury. It was a system built on logistics, precision, and innovation, and it gave soldiers a second chance at life that few armies in history had ever known. The Allies also invested heavily in training their medics. From the smallest field units to massive hospital ships, every level of care was meticulously organized. Young men and women were trained not only to bandage wounds, but to perform emergency surgery, stabilize shock, and administer drugs correctly. They learned to move fast, to stay calm under fire, and to make decisions that meant life or death. The idea was simple but revolutionary. Medicine should move with the army. Rather than waiting for the wounded to reach hospitals far behind the lines, the hospitals would go to them. Portable surgical units, sterilized instruments, and compact first aid kits became standard issue. The field medic was no longer just a helper. He was the first link in a chain of survival that stretched from the battlefield to the home front. This philosophy of mobility and preparedness was something the Japanese military had never fully embraced. Japan's medical establishment before the war was sophisticated in its own right, but it lacked the vast industrial base and research infrastructure of the West. Medical equipment was expensive and scarce. Antibiotics were virtually unknown in Japan's wartime medicine, and blood transfusion systems were still in their infancy. The military leadership, steeped in traditions of stoicism and sacrifice, placed little emphasis on preserving life after injury. To many Japanese officers, a wounded soldier was a liability rather than an asset. The idea of building a vast medical network to rescue and rehabilitate the wounded was seen as unnecessary, even indulgent. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the United States was turning medicine into a weapon of war. American factories that once produced automobiles and consumer goods were retooled to manufacture medical supplies. Pharmaceutical companies, backed by government funding, scaled up penicillin production to an unprecedented level. By 1944, Allied medical units carried thousands of doses into every major operation. Medical research centers, such as the Walter Reed Army Institute, coordinated experiments on wound treatment, nutrition, and recovery. Every advancement was tested, documented, and applied systematically. The result was not only more effective treatment, but also a growing confidence among soldiers that they were fighting for a nation that valued their lives. Even the transport systems reflected this new approach. The Allies developed efficient evacuation networks, using trucks, ships, and aircraft to move the wounded from the front lines to field hospitals and then to larger facilities farther back. In contrast, Japanese soldiers often had to walk or be carried for miles through jungles or mountains, only to arrive at medical posts with little more than bandages and morphine substitutes. The difference between a few hours and a few days often determined whether a man lived or died. To the Allies, every minute counted. To the Japanese, every delay was another quiet tragedy. By the time the Pacific Campaign began, the groundwork for Allied medical dominance was complete. Every syringe, every vial, every portable surgical table represented years of preparation. What looked like miracles to Japanese soldiers were in fact the results of decades of scientific progress and planning. The Allied forces had transformed medicine into strategy. Their doctors and medics were not just saving lives, they were shaping the course of the war itself. In the eyes of those who fought against them, it was a kind of power that transcended technology. It was proof that science, when organized and weaponized, could alter the very meaning of survival in war. When the war reached its fiercest stages, the true power of Allied medical science revealed itself in the heat of combat. Imagine the chaos of a beach landing, bullets cutting through the air, explosions shaking the sand, and the cries of the wounded echoing over the noise. Amid that chaos, medics in khaki uniforms sprinted between craters, dragging men to safety. Their hands were steady, their movements swift. They pressed bandages onto gaping wounds, injected morphine to ease the agony, and set up small stations of care right behind the front line. Within minutes, life and death decisions were being made with the precision of practiced hands. Soldiers who had been hit were no longer lost causes. They were patients, and the battle to save them began immediately. On islands like Guadalcanal and Tarawa, Allied field medics turned chaos into controlled urgency. They worked under fire, using plasma to replace blood and prevent shock. Penicillin was administered even before infections could take hold. Those who might have died from sepsis in previous wars were instead stabilized and transported to safety. The chain of evacuation was almost seamless. Jeeps, boats, and aircraft carried the wounded to fully equipped hospitals far behind the lines. Within hours, a soldier who had been bleeding on the sand was lying on a clean bed, attended by nurses and surgeons. For many, it felt as if the hand of death had reached for them and missed by inches. To the Japanese watching these operations unfold, it seemed like sorcery. Their own wounded, left behind in the jungle or caves, often died slowly from untreated injuries. Medics did what they could with limited tools: boiled instruments, herbal poultices, and prayers whispered in the dark. A gunshot to the leg could turn fatal within days, while burns and infections spread unchecked. Japanese commanders tried to maintain morale by emphasizing honor and sacrifice, but even the most disciplined soldier could not ignore what he saw. The Allies were not just fighting harder, they were surviving longer. The difference in battlefield survival began to shift the rhythm of war. Allied units were able to sustain offensives that would have broken other armies. In operations across the Solomon Islands and the Philippines, the ability to recover and return men to combat made a measurable difference. Wounded soldiers who once would have been written off were rejoining their units after a few weeks. It gave the Allies a steady supply of experienced fighters, while the Japanese faced a constant drain of manpower. Every man saved was another weapon in the Allied arsenal, another blow to the morale of their enemies. Beyond the numbers, the human element was powerful. Allied soldiers fought with the quiet reassurance that they were not alone. They trusted the medics who crawled through gunfire to reach them. They knew that if they fell, someone would come. This faith changed the way men faced battle. It gave them courage to take risks, to press forward even under heavy fire. For the Japanese, it was the opposite. Once wounded, a soldier often knew his fate was sealed. The despair that followed such knowledge could crush even the bravest heart. It was not just a physical difference. It was psychological warfare carried out through medicine. Accounts from both sides reveal how deeply this contrast affected morale. American letters home spoke with gratitude of the angels in khaki, the medics who saved lives every day. Japanese diaries told of comrades begging for water or morphine, their cries unanswered because supplies had run out. Some Japanese soldiers, too weak to fight or retreat, asked to be left behind to die with dignity. For every Allied soldier who lived, there was a Japanese soldier who perished in pain. The war of machines had become a war of medicine, and the outcome was becoming painfully clear. One American doctor later recalled treating a young Marine hit by shrapnel during the Battle of Peleliu. The man had lost half his blood and was barely conscious when they reached him. Within an hour, he received plasma, morphine, and surgery under a tent roof still shaking from nearby explosions. 3 days later, he was sitting up and talking. A week after that, he was preparing to rejoin his unit. Stories like this spread quickly through the ranks, becoming proof that survival was possible even in hellish conditions. The Japanese, listening from their hiding places, could only marvel and despair. By 1944, Allied medical superiority had become an invisible shield that protected every campaign. Where Japanese soldiers saw endless suffering, the Allies built systems of healing. The sight of medics running through smoke with Red Cross armbands became a symbol of hope. On every battlefield, they carried more than supplies. They carried belief. It was belief in human life, in the idea that saving one man was as important as taking ground. In the end, that belief turned out to be one of the Allies' most powerful weapons. Medicine had become not only a science of survival, but a strategy of victory. As the months of fighting turned into years, the medical divide between the Allies and Japan began to ripple far beyond the battlefield. It was no longer just about survival rates or the number of soldiers returning to duty. It became a question of endurance, morale, and the philosophy of warfare itself. Allied armies could sustain long, grueling campaigns because their wounded were treated, healed, and often sent back into battle. Every successful recovery strengthened not only manpower but also belief. For the first time in military history, medicine had become an active element of strategy, a factor that shaped the tempo of entire operations. On the other side, Japan's forces were slowly bleeding out both physically and psychologically. Their inability to care for the wounded eroded morale and made soldiers fear injury more than death. Commanders noticed that men began fighting recklessly, preferring to die in combat rather than risk being abandoned to infection or starvation in a makeshift tent. This despair infected entire units, weakening their cohesion. Reports from the front spoke of soldiers refusing evacuation, insisting on fighting to the end. The traditional Japanese ideals of honor and sacrifice, which had once inspired loyalty, now trapped their soldiers in hopelessness. Each victory the Allies gained on the ground was reinforced by their unseen victories in medical care. The psychological effects were profound. Allied troops developed an almost unshakable confidence in their medical systems. They knew that their lives were valued, that someone was always ready to risk everything to save them. This belief transformed fear into resilience. In contrast, Japanese soldiers began to feel abandoned by their own leaders. They saw that their opponents fought with the assurance of survival, while they fought under the shadow of inevitable death. Such knowledge gnawed at morale and made the Japanese military's famed discipline harder to maintain. The medical imbalance became a form of psychological warfare, breaking spirits long before battles were lost on the ground. At the command level, the consequences of Allied medical superiority became strategically visible. Generals like Douglas MacArthur and Chester Nimitz recognized that quick recovery and evacuation allowed them to plan continuous offensives without exhausting their forces. The logistics of healing became intertwined with the logistics of invasion. Hospital ships followed fleets into battle zones, and air evacuation systems reduced the time from injury to treatment to mere hours. This efficiency meant that campaigns could continue almost relentlessly. The Allies could push forward island after island, confident that their wounded would not be lost forever. It was a kind of momentum Japan could no longer match. Meanwhile, the Japanese high command faced a growing crisis. Their supply chains were stretched to the breaking point, their medical units underfunded and undersupplied. Requests for antibiotics and surgical tools went unanswered. By 1944, Japanese doctors were forced to reuse bandages and operate without anesthesia. They resorted to traditional herbal mixtures and alcohol to disinfect wounds. Even when Japan attempted to develop its own synthetic antibiotics, production was too small to make any real difference. The gulf between scientific modernity and traditional practice had widened into a chasm. On the battlefield, that gap translated directly into lives lost. This disparity also influenced how civilians perceived the war. In Allied nations, reports of medics saving lives became powerful propaganda. Newspapers published photographs of smiling soldiers recovering in clean hospital beds, tended by nurses in crisp uniforms. These images reassured families back home and strengthened public support for the war effort. Medicine became a symbol of compassion amid destruction, proof that the Allies fought not only to defeat tyranny, but to preserve life. In Japan, however, news from the front was censored. The suffering of the wounded was hidden, and tales of medical hardship were replaced with stories of glorious sacrifice. Yet behind the curtain of propaganda, despair grew among the families who never saw their sons return. In time, the consequences of this imbalance became measurable. Allied survival rates from combat injuries reached levels never before seen in war, often exceeding 90% for those who reached medical care. Japan's rates were far lower, and the loss of experienced soldiers compounded the already dire situation. Battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa illustrated this cruel arithmetic. The Allies could afford heavy casualties because they recovered so many of their wounded, while Japan's losses were permanent. Medical science had turned the scale of attrition decisively in one direction. But beyond statistics and strategy, the human stories told the real impact. For every Allied soldier who returned home with scars and stories of miraculous recovery, there were countless Japanese soldiers who never made it back. Their families received letters written weeks before death, their final words often apologetic for not dying sooner. For Japan, the war's medical failure was not just a logistical problem, but a moral one. It forced a reckoning with its values, a realization that courage alone could not sustain an army against science. By the final year of the war, the wider consequences were clear. The Allies' mastery of battlefield medicine had done more than save lives. It had reshaped the entire nature of warfare. No longer was victory measured solely in territory gained or enemies destroyed. It was also measured in how many could be saved, how quickly, and how effectively. The ability to heal became a marker of civilization and power. The Japanese soldiers, who had once viewed Allied medical practices with suspicion and awe, now faced the painful truth. They were witnessing the future of modern war, one where science, compassion, and efficiency were as decisive as bullets and bombs. By the final stages of the Pacific War, the medical gulf between Japan and the Allies had reached its most dramatic point. The battlefields of Iwo Jima and Okinawa became grim theaters where that difference was displayed with haunting clarity. On those islands, where every inch of ground was soaked in blood, the Allies demonstrated not only their firepower, but their mastery of life-saving science. As mortars screamed overhead and the ground shook from shellfire, medics worked in makeshift tents and trenches, transforming chaos into organized care. The air was filled with the metallic smell of blood and the sharp sting of antiseptic. Amid screams and smoke, doctors performed surgery, replaced blood with plasma, and fought infections with penicillin. To the wounded who lay on stretchers, staring at the canvas roofs above them, these actions felt miraculous. For the Japanese defenders, trapped in tunnels and caves, the contrast could not have been more devastating. Their own wounded lay in the dark, untreated, whispering prayers, or calling out for water. Many bled slowly to death. Others succumbed to fever, gangrene, and despair. Supplies were gone, and what little morphine they had was reserved for officers or the most desperate cases. The humid air reeked of sweat and rot. Flies swarmed around untreated wounds. Some soldiers chose to end their suffering by pulling the pins from their grenades. Others simply waited for death to come quietly. They had no illusions left, no medics to reach them, no medicine to save them, no hope of return. It was during these final campaigns that Japanese soldiers truly understood the scope of their enemy's advantage. Captured reports from the front described Allied medical stations as factories of life. Soldiers who were shot, burned, or crushed beneath rubble were being patched up and sent back into combat. The Japanese, exhausted and dying, watched as wave after wave of recovered enemies returned to the fight. It felt endless, inhuman, unstoppable. A young Japanese officer on Okinawa reportedly wrote in his diary, "They have medicine that conquers death itself. We have only courage, and courage cannot heal." His words captured the despair that spread through the ranks. The war was no longer just unwinnable, it was unimaginable. Allied medics, too, bore witness to the magnitude of their task. Many described the surreal rhythm of war and healing, rushing out under fire to drag back the wounded, feeling bullets, whistle past, then returning to their tents to operate for 20 hours straight. They fought exhaustion, heat, and terror. Their battlefield was not measured in yards gained, but in heartbeats saved. For every soldier they saved, the enemy lost one more reason to believe they could prevail. Medicine had become a silent weapon, striking not with force but with persistence and compassion. As Allied troops advanced across the Pacific, their medical operations grew even more refined. Hospital ships anchored offshore turned into floating cities of recovery, equipped with X-ray machines, surgical theaters, and refrigeration units for blood plasma. Aircraft were modified to evacuate the wounded in hours instead of days. In some cases, Soldiers injured in combat on one island were recovering in full hospitals within 24 hours. The Japanese could not fathom such a system. Their forces, isolated and cut off by naval blockades, could barely move supplies between islands, let alone maintain large medical infrastructures. The difference was now absolute. By mid-1945, as Okinawa fell and Japan faced the looming threat of invasion, the truth became painfully undeniable. The Allies had not only superior weapons and overwhelming numbers, but they also possessed the means to keep their soldiers alive. This was a kind of immortality the Japanese army could never achieve. The spirit of Bushido, the code that celebrated honorable death, had met an opponent that valued survival instead of sacrifice, and survival was winning. Japanese soldiers, who once mocked the Western fear of death, now saw that life itself had become the greatest weapon of the modern age. The climax of this medical revolution was not marked by a single battle, but by a shift in the very concept of warfare. Victory no longer belonged solely to those who could destroy, but to those who could preserve. The Allies had proven that healing could be as strategic as killing, that compassion could coexist with conquest. On the shattered beaches and smoking hills of the Pacific, medicine had rewritten the logic of war. The Japanese soldiers who survived to witness it were left in awe and disbelief. To them, it seemed that their enemy had unlocked a secret, one not of death, but of defiance against it. In those final days, as Japan's empire crumbled and surrender loomed, it was not only the might of bombs or bullets that had broken them, but the quiet, unstoppable power of healing itself. When the war finally ended and the guns fell silent, the echoes of medical triumph resonated far beyond the ruins of the Pacific. The same hospitals that had once treated the wounded now began to heal the world itself. In the aftermath of surrender, Japan lay broken and humbled. Cities were in ashes, industries destroyed, and millions left without homes or hope. Yet from that devastation, lessons from the battlefield began to take root. Japanese doctors and scientists who had once watched in awe as Allied medicine saved lives now sought to understand it. The tools and techniques that had astonished them in war became the foundation for a new era of peace and progress. In the years following the occupation, Japan invited medical advisors from the United States and other Allied nations to help rebuild its healthcare system. The flow of knowledge that once symbolized defeat now became a bridge toward modernization. Hospitals were rebuilt, medical schools reformed, and research institutions established with support from abroad. Penicillin, which had once been a mysterious and unattainable drug, became a standard medicine across Japan. For many Japanese doctors, learning to use it was more than professional growth. It was an act of reconciliation with the science that had once stood against them. From tragedy came transformation, and the nation that had once lagged behind began to emerge as one of the most advanced medical powers in Asia. For the Allies, the legacy of wartime medicine continued to evolve as well. The breakthroughs that saved soldiers on the front lines became the foundation for modern emergency medicine, trauma care, and surgery. Techniques developed under the pressure of combat, blood transfusion, antibiotic therapy, field triage, found their way into civilian hospitals around the world. The concept of rapid medical response, perfected in the jungles and beaches of the Pacific, would later become standard practice in peacetime disasters, car accidents, and hospitals everywhere. War, in all its horror, had forced humanity to innovate in ways that peacetime never could. But this legacy carried a weight of memory. For the medics and doctors who served, victory was measured not in the number of lives taken, but in the number of lives saved. Many could never forget the faces of those they had pulled from the brink of death, the gratitude in their eyes, the trembling hands clutching their uniforms. They remembered the smell of antiseptic mixing with smoke, the sound of whispered prayers in the chaos, and the endless nights spent fighting time itself. For them, medicine was not only a science but a moral compass amid destruction. Their quiet courage, often overlooked in the grand stories of war, became a testament to humanity's resilience, even in its darkest hour. Japanese veterans, too, carried their own reflections. Many spoke of the shock they felt upon realizing how far medical science had advanced in the West. Some described it as a moment of awakening, a realization that true strength lay not only in the will to die, but in the ability to preserve life. These memories shaped Japan's post-war philosophy, influencing its later emphasis on technology, education, and research. The soldiers who once watched Allied medics save men they thought doomed now lived to see their own nation embrace that same power. It was a transformation that redefined not only medicine, but the meaning of progress itself. As decades passed, historians came to see this unseen war of healing as one of the most profound revolutions of the 20th century. The clash between Japan and the Allied powers was not just a military confrontation. It was a collision between two worldviews. On one side stood tradition, sacrifice, and endurance. On the other stood innovation, compassion, and scientific mastery. The outcome reshaped the world in ways no bullet ever could. The battlefield had proven that knowledge was power, and that the ability to save life could determine the fate of nations. Today, when we speak of World War II, we often remember the weapons, the battles, and the destruction. Yet hidden within that chaos lies another story, a story of doctors and medics, of scientists and patients, of survival against impossible odds. The 5 great medical breakthroughs that stunned Japanese soldiers on the battlefield did more than change a war. They changed humanity's understanding of what war could be. From the ashes of the Pacific rose a new truth, that healing, even in the midst of destruction, can be the greatest victory of all.